Hi, this is my presentation on the subgenre fairy tale retellings. In order to really understand a retelling, it is important to understand fairy tales. A fairy tale is a story that usually has a fantastical or magical element. There are often ogres, dwarves, elves, or witches, etc. The more modern tales have a happily ever after for their main characters. The Grimm brothers are most associated with original printing of fairy tales or folklore. Their first published book was dark, with a sense of danger and violence. The brothers altered their own works to add a more whimsical once-upon-a-time line to the beginning of each story, as well as remove a great deal, but not all, of the brutality. They also added a moral to the end of each story to teach the reader. Fairy tales started as oral stories passed down from generation to generation while representing the values and fears of those communities. Fairy tales were not intended just for children, but for an entire community. They served as a reminder of the evil that lurked in the shadows. And fairy tales have evolved over the years to reflect each generation's morals and values, crescendoing in the 19th century. However, in 1937, Disney altered the genre once again, but maintained the core focus of the stories. Each story focused on fierce patriotism and loyalty to certain qualities like male dominance, notions of obedient, passive, victimized women, and of course, the element of myth and magic. The general formula involved a princess, often a pawn in a villain's game, finding love in a prince she just met, but first the prince must overcome an obstacle before winning the princess. Most of the stories now create more three-dimensional characters that have thoughts and feelings that are different than the core elements of traditional stories. Although the retellings are vast in their differences, there are three main categories. Some may even overlap. 1. Past or typical time period. The story diverts in gender, race, and values, but takes place in stereotypical fairy tale lands or the past. Next, modern and futuristic time periods. They are similar in storyline, but with new, more modern settings, and often revised with gender and race differences. And finally, LGBT retellings. Gender of characters are changed to reflect a variety of gender differences. These stories can take place at any time period, although it seems that most frequently the stories are taking place during a more traditional time period. I spent a great deal of time researching LGBT fairy tales, but I was unable to come up with any literature that reflected a retelling of a classic story with a transgender character. However, there are a plethora of stories for lesbian, gay, and bisexual characters. In addition to the lack of trans characters, there was also a lack of novels that really reflected a diverse ethnic and racial background and abilities. An example of a past or typical time period is easy to come by. Baba Ali and the Clockwork Djinn is a beautiful retelling of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. It perfectly meshes Middle Eastern tales with steampunk mentalities. Ali bin Masood is a young artisan living in London on what he feels is a well-meaningful exile or really an apprenticeship. Unable to fully fit into London culture, his only refuge is Charles Babbage, a real-life character that is most well known for originating the concept for the programmable computer. Ali's father dies. Ali receives a puzzle box before his trip home, and so his venture begins. There is a little romance, but it takes place mostly out of the text. The story tries to stay within the realms of the original tale, but does a great job of introducing the steampunk mentality. I highly suggest this book for anyone who loves steampunk or the 40 Thieves story. Beastly is a great example of modern time retellings, and like many young adult novels, it's also a movie. Unfortunately, teens are often more familiar with the cinematic retellings than the books. Beastly is the story of a self-absorbed teenage boy, Kyle Kingsbury, he later renames himself Adrian, who was punished by a witch from his English class for his behavior. Locked away by his father, his only companions are the housekeeper and his blind tutor. When a drug dealer tries to rob him and gets caught, the man offers his daughter to Kyle in order to avoid his punishment. Lindy and Kyle, now Adrian, build a rapport, and as they say, it's a tale as old as time. Although there are many examples of LGBT retellings, Ash is one of the most popular. Ash is the dark retelling of Cinderella. Ash, short for Aisling, has a pretty horrible life after her father dies. Living under the strict and cruel hand of her stepmother, Ash seeks refuge in fairy tales. She meets a dark and dangerous fairy, and so starts her adventure. When Ash meets Kesa, the king's huntress, Ash must make a decision between fairy tale dreams and true love. Although the books I discussed are focused mostly on retelling the fairy tale from the perspective of the hero or heroine, there has been an interest in retelling stories from the perspective of the villain, most notably creating backstories. Although there are not many books about this in the young adult genre, books like The True Story of the Three Little Pigs, TV shows like Once Upon a Time, or movies like Maleficent all spend time creating empathy for the villain and develop a reason the characters turned evil. This is especially important as most villains have represented a counterpoint to every generation's moral and values. For example, in The Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West, a one-dimensional character, is believed to be a symbol of corporate greed. Decades later, Wicked gives us a more complex understanding of the characters than the one we meet in the original book. I love fairy tales and the retelling, so I have some additional recommendations of stories, such as Spindle and Rose, Of Beast and Beauty, and The Princess Bride, which is my personal favorite. And as they say in fairy tale land, they all lived happily ever after.